Pope Leo XIV picked up a pen and signed a document that almost no one noticed. But inside the Vatican, everything changed. There is a man in Rome that very few Catholics know by name, but inside the Vatican, everyone knows who he is. He controlled the day-to-day administration of the most important diocese in the entire Catholic Church. He had the ear of the most powerful people in Rome. His rise was unlike anything the diocese had ever seen. And then, just like that, everything this man had built, every position, every power, every influence was gone. No announcement, no press conference, no explanation, just silence. And every cardinal in Rome had no answer. To understand what happened, you have to go back to 2018. That was the year Renato Tarantelli Baccari was ordained as a priest. He was 40 years old. For most men who enter the priesthood that late in life, that would be the beginning of a long, quiet journey through parish ministry, a local church, a community, a neighborhood where everyone knows your name. Maybe after decades of faithful and humble service, a modest administrative role in the diocese, a title, a small office. That is how it works for almost everyone. But Tarantelli Baccari was not like almost everyone. Before putting on a Roman collar, he had spent years in a completely different world, the world of civil law. He was a lawyer, and not just a lawyer in the abstract sense. He understood institutions from the inside. He understood how power moves through structures, through offices, through the language of documents. He understood that in any large organization, whether a court of law or a diocese, the person who controls the paperwork often controls far more than people realize. And the moment he stepped inside the Diocese of Rome, he began to climb. Not slowly, not cautiously. He climbed fast and he climbed strategically, in a way that left veterans of the Roman clergy watching with quiet disbelief. Within just a few years of his ordination, he had accumulated a remarkable concentration of roles inside the Vicariate of Rome. He became commissioner of several canonical foundations inside the diocese, overseeing financial and legal entities with significant assets. He worked on the Diocesan Child Abuse Commission, gaining access to some of the most sensitive files in the entire Vicariate. He became director of the legal office, the man whose signature appeared on the diocese's most consequential legal decisions. He served as data protection officer of the Vicariate of Rome, controlling the flow of information within the institution. And on top of all of that, he became episcopal vicar for legal and administrative affairs, the man responsible for the entire legal architecture of the Pope's own diocese. Let that sink in for a moment. This is not a small parish in a quiet Italian town. The Diocese of Rome is the diocese of the Pope himself. It is the spiritual and administrative center of the Catholic world. Over 1 billion Catholics look to Rome, and Tarantelli Baccari, just a few years out of seminary, was sitting at the heart of its machinery, with his hands on its legal structures, its financial oversight, its sensitive information, and its day-to-day administration. And then, in November 2024, Pope Francis made it official. Tarantelli Baccari was consecrated as auxiliary bishop and appointed vice-gerent of the Diocese of Rome, the third most powerful position in the diocese, right behind the Pope himself and the cardinal vicar. His rise, according to the Pillar, raised many eyebrows inside Rome. He had gone from ordination to bishop in just 6 years, 1 year more than the absolute minimum, required by canon law, 1 year above the floor. That is how fast he moved. If you're watching this from another country and you want to understand just how extraordinary that timeline is, drop your city in the comments right now, because whether you're in Brazil, Nigeria, the Philippines, or the United States, the speed of this man's rise inside one of the most tradition-bound institutions on earth is going to hit you differently, depending on where you come from. I want to hear from you. Now, the question that no one was asking publicly, but that everyone was whispering about privately, was a simple one. How does a man with no seminary formation, before the age of 40, no long track record in pastoral ministry, no decades of parish service behind him, rise to one of the most powerful administrative positions in the entire Catholic Church in just 6 years? The answer, at least in part, was Pope Francis. Tarantelli Baccari was not merely a beneficiary of Francis's pontificate, He was, in many ways, one of its architects inside Rome. In January 2023, Pope Francis promulgated a sweeping reform of the Diocese of Rome, a document called In Ecclesiarum Communione. It restructured the entire governance of the vicariate from the ground up, and the changes it made were significant. The reform gave enormous new authority to the Episcopal Council and, crucially, to the vice-gerent. It reduced the traditional power of the cardinal vicar, who for centuries had been the Pope's primary representative in governing the diocese, and redistributed decision-making across a more collegial synodal structure. The cardinal vicar could no longer make major appointments or key decisions without the council's consent. The council was now defined as the primary body of synodality in the diocese, the top institution for pastoral and administrative decisions. And Tarantelli Baccari, who was widely seen inside Rome as one of the key figures behind that reform, was perfectly positioned to benefit from everything it created. Critics inside the diocese saw exactly what was happening. They argued that the reform had created unnecessary bureaucratic expansion at a time when the Diocese of Rome's finances were far from ideal. They looked at the accumulation: commissioner, legal director, data, protection officer, episcopal vicar, and now vicegerent. And they saw something that made them uncomfortable. Too much influence concentrated in the hands of one man. A man who had arrived very recently. A man who had climbed very fast. A man whose rise had never been fully explained to the priests who had spent their entire lives serving the diocese he now helped run. But as long as Pope Francis was alive, none of that mattered. The reform stood. The structure held. Tarantelli Baccari remained at the center of it all. And the whispers stayed whispers. If you've been following the changes happening inside the Vatican since Leo XIII became Pope, tell me in the comments. Did you expect him to move this fast? I want to know what you think. Then Pope Francis died, and everything Tarantelli Baccari had built suddenly stood on very uncertain ground, because the man who came next was nothing like the man who had protected him. Pope Leo XIII came into his pontificate with a completely different style. Where Francis governed through bold gestures, dramatic announcements, and sweeping public declarations that made headlines around the world, Leo XIII moves in an entirely different way. Quietly, methodically, with the precision of someone who has spent a lifetime studying how institutions actually function and how to change them without creating unnecessary conflict. He is a trained canon lawyer, a former math major, a man who, by all accounts, reads every word of every document before he signs anything. And according to observers who cover the Vatican closely, from the earliest days of his pontificate, Leo XIII made one thing clear. He was not interested in making headlines. He was interested in making changes. And the Diocese of Rome, the Pope's own diocese, the one whose governance had been reshaped by his predecessor's 2023 reform, the one where Tarantelli Baccari now sat as vice-gerent, was one of the very first places he looked. The signs began almost immediately. In the early months of his pontificate, Leo XIV quietly restored the historic center sector of the Diocese of Rome, a pastoral zone that Pope Francis had abolished in October 2024, just days before the opening of the Synod on Synodality, in a move that had stunned the Roman clergy. The priests of the historic center had found out about the decision only days before it was made public. One of them told an Italian newspaper at the time that it was paradoxical that the Synod on Synodality should open at precisely that moment. Leo XIV reversed it in November 2025. No drama, no press conference, just a decision quietly made and quietly implemented. That reversal was the first signal, but it was not the last. On February 25, 2026, Leo XIV did two things simultaneously. First, he announced the appointment of 4 new auxiliary bishops for the Diocese of Rome, men who had spent their entire careers serving in Roman parishes, priests with deep roots in the city, men the local clergy already knew and trusted. Their names were Stefano Scarapani, Alessandro Zenobi, Andrea Carleval, and Marco Valenti. Every one of them was a Roman priest, elevated from within, chosen for their pastoral experience rather than their administrative connections. It was a deliberate statement about what kind of bishop Leo XIV valued. But alongside those appointments, he did something else. He quietly established a working group made up of all the auxiliary bishops and the cardinal vicar, with a very specific mandate. Review the 2023 reform, study how it had been implemented, identify what was working and what was not. Come back with recommendations. On the surface, it looked administrative, procedural, the kind of internal review that large institutions conduct all the time and that rarely changes anything. But inside Rome, among the people who understood how these structures worked, the message was unmistakable. The 2023 reform, the one that had elevated the vicegerent's power, the one that Tarantelli Baccari had helped build, and from which he had so dramatically benefited, was under examination. And as Rome was beginning to understand about Leo XIII, he does not examine things in order to leave them unchanged. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, because what Leo XIII does next, and how he reshapes the church from the inside without anyone seeing it coming, is exactly what we cover here. You don't want to miss it. The working group spent months doing its work. They went through the governing structures of the vicariate line by line. They looked at where decision-making authority was concentrated. They looked at whether the reform had created the kind of efficient, mission-driven diocese it had promised, or whether it had created something else, a bureaucratic expansion, a concentration of power in a small number of hands, a structure that in practice had not served the priests and parishes of Rome the way it was supposed to. What they found, or at least what they recommended, shaped everything that followed. Then came June 30th, 2026. Pope Leo XIII had spent that day, which is traditionally his weekly day off, signing document after document. A sweeping overhaul of the Vatican's financial oversight agency, a series of curial appointments, and then, almost without ceremony, tucked into the same flurry of legislation, a motu proprio addressed to the Diocese of Rome. It was called Confirma Fratres Tuos, confirm your brothers. The phrase comes from the Gospel of Luke, from the moment the risen Christ turns to Peter and says, "Strengthen those around you." It is a phrase about leadership through service, about authority exercised not for personal gain, but for the good of the community. The choice of that title for a document that was about to dismantle the power structure that Tarantelli Baccari had built was not accidental. The document completely replaced In Ecclesiarum Communione, the 2023 constitution that Pope Francis had promulgated and that Tarantelli Baccari had helped architect. As reported by OSV News, this was not a partial adjustment or a minor revision. It was a full repeal and a full replacement. The entire governing framework of the Diocese of Rome, rewritten from the ground up, and the changes were precise, almost surgical in their targeting. The cardinal vicar, whose authority had been significantly curtailed by the 2023 reform, was restored as the unambiguous principal authority in the day-to-day government of the diocese. The Episcopal Council, which Francis's constitution had elevated to the primary body of synodality, and the top institutional forum for pastoral and administrative decisions, was quietly, but firmly downgraded. It became once again a strictly consultative body. The requirement that it meet 3 times a month gone. The requirement that it consent to appointments of chaplains, rectors, and heads of pastoral services gone. The provision that had given the council veto power over the cardinal vicar unless the Pope personally overruled them gone. And then there was the vicegerent, the office that Tarantelli Baccari held. The position that the 2023 reform had elevated to a level of influence that no vicegerent in recent memory had ever held. The role through which he had accumulated and exercised so much of his power. Confirma Fratres Tuos created a new position alongside it, the moderator of the Curia, appointed directly by the Pope for a 5-year term. And this new moderator now holds many of the day-to-day administrative responsibilities that had previously belonged to the vicegerent. In one document, on one day, without a single word addressed to Tarantelli Baccari personally. No announcement, no statement, no letter to the diocese, no explanation offered to the public, to the clergy, or to the cardinals. Just a restructuring so precisely, targeted that everyone inside Rome understood immediately what it meant, even though no one said it out loud. What do you think Leo XIV is really doing inside the Vatican? Is this the kind of reform the Church has needed for a long time? Or is something more complicated going on beneath the surface? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. The document was signed. The restructuring was done. And inside Rome, the silence that followed was louder than any announcement could have been. Because in institutions like the Catholic Church, silence is not the absence of communication. Silence is its own language, and everyone inside the Diocese of Rome, every priest, every bishop, every cardinal who had watched Tarantelli Baccari accumulate power over the previous years, understood exactly what that silence was saying. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what life inside the Diocese of Rome had actually been like in the final years of Pope Francis's pontificate. It had not been easy. Francis's relationship with the Roman clergy had grown increasingly tense, particularly toward the end of his pontificate. The reform of 2023 had not been received the way he had hoped. Many priests inside the diocese felt that it had been imposed on them rather than developed with them. The abolition of the historic center pastoral sector, in October 2024, announced just days before the opening of the Synod on Synodality, a synod built entirely around the concept of listening and consultation, had been received as a kind of institutional insult. Priests who had served those parishes for decades found out about the decision in a meeting held just days before it was made public. No consultation. No dialogue. Just a decision. Hey, down from above, effective immediately. And through all of it, Tarantelli Baccari had been seen, rightly or wrongly, as one of the central figures of that system. A man who had climbed fast, a man who had accumulated power quietly, a man whose influence over the legal and administrative machinery of the diocese had made him, in the eyes of many Roman clergy, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. When Confirma Fratres Tuos was signed on June 30, 2026, the reaction inside the diocese was not one of shock or outrage. According to sources in Rome cited by the Pillar, priests inside the diocese described the moment as a breath of fresh air, a release of pressure that had been building for years. Some called it simply a sigh of relief. Think about what that means. These are men who have given their lives to the Church. Men who wake up every morning and serve their parishes, their communities, their people. They are not politicians. They are not journalists. They do not make public statements about power struggles inside the Vatican. And yet, when a pope signed a document that dismantled the structure that Tarantelli Baccari had helped build, with no announcement, no press conference, no drama, they felt relief. That tells you something. Not about one man, but about a system. About what it feels like to work inside an institution where power has been concentrated in ways that feel wrong, and about what it means when someone at the top decides, quietly and without fanfare, to change it. Now, here is where it gets interesting, because Leo XIV never said any of this publicly. He never named Tarantelli Baccari. He never issued a statement explaining the reasoning behind the reform. He never held a press conference to announce what he was doing or why. The document itself was framed entirely in the language of institutional improvement, of building on what Francis had started, of refining the governance structures of the vicariate, of making the diocese more effective in its evangelizing mission. And yet, the people inside Rome who knew the structures, who understood what each change meant in practice, who had lived through the years of accumulation and tension, they did not need an explanation. The document spoke for itself. Every change was a message. Every power that was removed from one office was a message. Every authority that was restored to the cardinal vicar was a message. This is how Leo XIV operates, not through confrontation, not through public rebuke, not through dramatic gestures that generate headlines. He operates through documents, through structures, through the quiet, methodical work of a man who understands that the most lasting changes are the ones made carefully, precisely, and without unnecessary noise. If you've never subscribed to this channel and you're still watching, this is the kind of story we tell here. The things that happen inside the Vatican that don't make the front page, but that reshape the church in ways that matter. Hit that subscribe button. You won't regret it. And the question that remains, the one that nobody inside Rome is willing to answer on the record, is this. What happens to Tarantelli Baccari now? Various sources inside the diocese have offered different predictions. Some believe he will be appointed as the bishop of a smaller Italian diocese. A not uncommon path for officials who have fallen out of favor in Rome. A quieter post. A less prominent role. Far from the center of things. Others believe he will remain in Rome for the foreseeable future, holding his title as auxiliary bishop, overseeing one of the city's territorial sectors but stripped of the administrative influence that had defined his rise. What is certain is this: the power he held is gone. The structure that supported it has been dismantled. The document that gave the vicegerent its extraordinary authority has been repealed and replaced. And the man who signed that replacement did so on his day off, tucked between a financial reform and a series of curial appointments without a single word addressed to the man most affected by it. That is a message, delivered in the clearest possible way, by a pope who has no interest in making things louder than they need to be. There is a pattern forming inside this pontificate, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Leo XIV does not govern the way people expected him to. When he was elected, many inside the church assumed he would be a transitional pope, a stabilizing figure, someone who would hold the institution steady after the turbulence of the Francis years, make a few adjustments and leave the deeper questions for whoever came next. That is what many expected. That is not what is happening. What is happening is something far more deliberate, far more strategic. Leo XIV is quietly, systematically, and without any public announcement, dismantling the structures that concentrated power in ways he believes were wrong, and rebuilding them in ways that he believes will serve the church better. He is doing it through documents, through appointments, through reforms that look technical and administrative from the outside, but that carry enormous weight for the people living inside them. The Diocese of Rome was first, but it will not be last. Think about the sequence of events. He restores the historic center sector that Francis had abolished. He appoints 4 new auxiliary bishops drawn entirely from the Roman clergy, men with decades of parish experience, men the local priests already know. He establishes a working group to review the 2023 reform. He waits. He listens. And then, on a Tuesday that was supposed to be his day off, he signs Confirma Fratres Tuos and rewrites the governing structure of the most important diocese in the Catholic world. No drama with anyone, just results. This is what makes Leo XIV genuinely difficult to categorize. He is not undoing everything Francis built. The document itself says so explicitly, preserving the missionary, orientation of the vicariate, the language of synodality, the pastoral vision that Francis spent years developing, but he is insisting that those principles be embedded in clearer structures, governed by clearer lines of authority, with less room for the kind of power accumulation that turned one relatively new priest into one of the most influential administrators in Rome in just a few years. He is, in a word, building something, carefully, brick by brick, document by document, appointment by appointment, and the cardinals who gathered in Rome for the extraordinary consistory at the end of June 2026, the second such meeting Leo XIV had called in just 1 year, heard him say something that deserves to be taken seriously. He told them that his ministry cannot be carried out alone, that he needs their strong, explicit, and public support, that the governance of the universal church is not a one-man operation. That is not the language of a transitional pope. That is the language of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is making sure the people around him are ready to go there with him. And that matters, because the Catholic Church is not a small organization. It is a global institution with over 1 billion members operating in every country on earth, touching the lives of people in ways that go far beyond Sunday Mass. When a pope reshapes its governance, even quietly, even through documents that most people will never read, the effects ripple outward in ways that take years, sometimes decades, to fully understand. The priests of Rome feel it first, then the bishops of Italy, then the church around the world. What Leo XIV is doing in Rome is not just about Rome. It is a signal, a demonstration of how he intends to govern, a living example right there in the Pope's own diocese of what it looks like when an institution is led with clarity, with structure, with a respect for the people who have spent their lives inside it. The priests who woke up the morning after Confirma Fratres Tuos and felt that sigh of relief. They were not just relieved for themselves. They were relieved because they recognized something they had not felt in a long time. A pope who was paying attention to them. A pope who had listened to what they were living through. A pope who acted not with noise, not with drama, but with precision. That is rare, and it matters more than most people realize. What comes next, no one can say with certainty. The Diocese of Rome has been reshaped. The Vatican's financial oversight has been overhauled. The power structures that define the final years of the Francis pontificate are being quietly, but systematically revised. And all of it is happening in a style so understated, so methodical, so deliberately removed from the noise of the news cycle, that most of the world hasn't fully noticed yet. But inside Rome they have noticed. The priests have noticed. The bishops have noticed. The cardinals have noticed. And the man whose rapid rise defined so much of what the Diocese of Rome looked like for the past 2 years, Renato Tarantelli Baccari, has certainly noticed. A pope picked up a pen, signed a document, said nothing publicly, and everything changed. That is the story of Leo XIII, and we are still the very early chapters of it. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who follows the Church. Leave a comment below telling me what you think Leo XIV's next move will be. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because the story of this pontificate is just beginning, and we are going to be here for every chapter of it. Thank you for watching. God bless you wherever in the world you are watching from.